Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are breaking down the science of what makes every single living thing unique. We're going to unpack what makes you, me, and every other creature on this planet totally one of a kind.
Okay, let's kick things off with a question that seems pretty simple on the surface. Have you ever actually looked, really looked, inside a bag of crisps and noticed that no two are ever the same, right? Some are folded over, some are super flat, some are huge, others are tiny. It might sound a little silly, but this is the perfect starting point for one of the biggest ideas in all of biology.
The answer to why every crisp is different, well, it all comes down to one single, powerful word: variation. This is the exact same reason our world is filled with such an incredible diversity of life. It is, quite literally, the engine of individuality.
So, let's get a little more specific. What exactly does a scientist mean when they use the word variation?
In biology, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's just all the differences, big and small, that you can find between individuals of the same species. Think about all the people you know, or even just a flock of birds in a park. Variation is the reason no two are ever perfectly identical.
All right, this brings us to the really big question. Where do all these differences come from? Is it something we're born with, our nature, or is it something that happens to us during our lives, our nurture?
Well, it turns out there are two main drivers. First up, you've got genetic variation. These are all the traits you inherit from your parents through your DNA, things like your eye color, your natural hair color, stuff like that. And then on the other hand, there's environmental variation. These are differences caused by your surroundings and life experiences, like getting a scar from a fall or deciding to get a tattoo. You acquire these things, but you don't pass them on to your kids.
But it's not always so black and white. A lot of traits, like your height or your weight, are actually a fascinating mix of both. Your genes might set a sort of potential range for how tall you can get, but your environment, especially things like nutrition when you're growing up, plays a massive part in deciding where you actually end up on that scale. It's the perfect example of nature and nurture working hand in hand.
Now, this next part is really important. We just talked about the causes of variation, genetics and environment. But now we're going to shift gears and talk about how scientists actually measure and categorize all this variation. This isn't about the why it happens anymore. It's about the what we see.
First, we have what's called continuous variation. The best way to think about this is like a smooth spectrum, or maybe a volume dial. It's for traits that don't just fit into neat little boxes, but can have any value along a whole range.
And the complete opposite of that is discontinuous variation. So if continuous is a volume dial, this is more like a light switch. It's either on or it's off. These are the traits that fall into very clear, separate categories with absolutely no middle ground.
Okay, so let's dig into continuous variation a little more and see what this spectrum of traits really looks like out there in the world.
Height is the perfect classic example. People aren't just short or tall, right? You can be 180 centimeters, or 181, or 180 and a half. Literally any value in between is possible. The same goes for things like your arm span or your weight. They exist on a continuous range.
And here's what's so cool about this. When you take a continuous trait like height and you measure it across a huge population, you almost always end up with this classic shape, a bell curve. This is called a normal distribution. And it just shows that most people cluster right around the average, with fewer and fewer people at the extreme ends, so the very short and the very tall.
Now, let's flip the coin and look at those light switch traits. How do we measure and visualize the ones that fall into these really distinct categories?
These are the characteristics where you're either one thing or another. Take your blood group, for instance. It can only be A, B, AB, or O. There's no such thing as being sort of blood type A. Or how about this one? The ability to roll your tongue. Go on, try it. You can either do it or you can't. It's a straight up yes or no.
So, as you can imagine, when you graph this kind of data, it looks totally different. Instead of that smooth curve we just saw, you get these very distinct separate bars. Each bar is its own category, and there are these obvious gaps in between, because, well, you just can't have any intermediate values. So let's pull all that together. If you're looking at a trait that exists on a spectrum, like height, that's continuous variation, and its graph is probably going to look like a bell curve. But if you're measuring a trait that falls into neat groups, like blood type, that's discontinuous variation, and you'll see separate bars on the chart. And what's really going on behind the scenes is that continuous traits are often influenced by lots of genes plus the environment, while discontinuous traits are usually controlled by just one or a few genes, giving you those clean categories.
So really, the big takeaway here is this. Variation is the very thing that makes life so interesting. Whether it's from our genes, our environment, or both, it's what makes everything unique, from the crisps in a bag to every single person on the planet.
And that leaves us with one last massive question to chew on. We've established that all these differences exist, right? But what happens when the environment starts to favor some of these variations over others? Well, that's the moment variation stops just being interesting and becomes the raw fuel for evolution itself. But that is a story for another explainer.